I've always been good at noticing things other people miss. The way shadows fall differently when someone's standing just outside your peripheral vision, the pause between words that stretches a heartbeat too long, the weight of eyes on your back when you're supposedly alone. Maybe that's why I knew something was changing between Marcus and me long before either of us was ready to name it. We'd been roommates for 8 months by then, thrown together by the cruel mathematics of college housing costs and mutual desperation for something affordable within walking distance of campus. On paper, we couldn't have been more incompatible. Marcus Chen, loud, magnetic, the kind of person who collected friends like other people collected coffee cups, always texting, always laughing, always bringing home different girls whose names I'd learned just long enough to forget them by the next week. And then there was me, David Sullivan, economics major, part-time library assistant, full-time observer of other people's lives. I read books on Friday nights while Marcus threw parties. I made grocery lists while he made spontaneous plans. I measured coffee beans while he poured energy drinks straight from the can at 2 in the morning. But here's the thing about living with someone in a space barely large enough to qualify as an apartment: you start to see past the surface, past the performance. The first time I caught him looking at me, really looking, was 3 months ago. I was sitting at our excuse for a kitchen table, laptop open, working on a macroeconomics paper that was slowly killing my will to live. The fluorescent light above flickered intermittently, casting everything in that harsh institutional glow that made our place feel more like a dorm room than a home. Marcus was supposed to be getting ready for some party. I could hear him in his room, music playing, the sound of hangers scraping against the closet rod. Normal sounds, background noise I'd grown accustomed to. But when I looked up to stretch my neck, he was standing in the hallway just watching me. Not moving, not speaking. Just watching with this expression I couldn't read. Something between curiosity and something else, something heavier. The moment lasted maybe 3 seconds. Long enough for my stomach to do this weird flip. Long enough for me to wonder if I'd imagined the intensity in his dark eyes. Then he blinked, grinned that easy grin of his, and called out, "You sure you don't want to come tonight? Jenny's bringing her friend Sarah, the one with the—" "I'm good," I said, already looking back at my screen. "Thanks, though." But I could feel the weight of his gaze lingering for another few seconds before he finally moved away. I told myself I'd imagined it. The second time was harder to dismiss. It was a Thursday evening in late September, rain drumming against our single window with that steady persistence that makes everything feel smaller, more intimate. I'd been fighting with my laptop for the better part of an hour, trying to coax life back into its dying battery, when Marcus emerged from his room looking unusually subdued. "Ordering Thai," he said, holding up his phone. "You want your usual?" I nodded, not looking up from my screen. "Pad see ew, extra vegetables? Medium spice? You know it." This was our routine. Comfortable. Predictable. Marcus handled the food ordering because I inevitably spent 10 minutes agonizing over minor variations in the menu. I handled the tip calculation because Marcus had a tendency to either way over tip or forget entirely. But that night, something felt different. Instead of retreating to his room to wait for delivery, Marcus lingered, cleaned the kitchen counters that weren't particularly dirty, organized the stack of mail we'd been ignoring for days, small, purposeless movements that kept him in my line of sight. When the food arrived, we did something we rarely did, ate together at the table instead of retreating to our separate spaces. The rain continued its steady percussion against the glass, and the overhead light cast long shadows across Marcus's face as he picked at his pad thai. "You ever wonder what people really think of you?" he asked suddenly, his voice softer than usual. I looked up from my container, fork halfway to my mouth. Marcus was staring at his food, not meeting my eyes, which was unusual for him. Marcus looked at everything and everyone directly, boldly. It was one of the things I'd noticed about him from the beginning, the way he took up space not just physically but visually, always making eye contact, always fully present in a way that could be either magnetic or overwhelming depending on your tolerance for intensity. "Only when I care about the answer," I said. Something shifted in his expression then. His eyes found mine, and there was that look again, that weighted attention that made my chest feel tight, like he was trying to solve some equation that involved both of us. "Do you?" he asked. "Care about the answer?" The question hung between us, loaded with implications I wasn't ready to examine. Outside, the rain picked up, and somewhere in the building, a door slammed shut. "Depends on who's asking," I said finally. Marcus smiled then, but it wasn't his usual easy grin. This one was smaller, more uncertain, more real. "Right," he said. "Of course." We finished eating in relative silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. I kept stealing glances at him across the small table, noticing things I'd trained myself not to notice. The way he rolled his sleeves up to his elbows, the small scar on his chin from a childhood accident he'd mentioned once in passing, the way he ate with focused attention, like even something as simple as pad thai deserved his full concentration. When we were done, I started clearing the containers, but Marcus caught my wrist as I reached for his. "I got it," he said. His fingers were warm against my skin, and he held on just a beat longer than necessary. Long enough for me to notice the callus on his thumb from his guitar playing. Long enough for my pulse to quicken in a way that had nothing to do with surprise. "Thanks," I managed. He nodded and let go, but I could feel the phantom warmth of his touch as I walked back to my room. That night, I lay awake listening to the rain and trying not to think about the way Marcus had looked at me across the dinner table, like he was seeing something I wasn't sure I was ready to show. The third incident was the one that made it impossible to pretend nothing was happening. It was a Saturday night in early October, and Marcus had dragged me to a party at some off-campus house that smelled like stale beer and bad decisions. I hadn't wanted to go, but Marcus had used his particular brand of persistent charm, the kind that made no feel unnecessarily stubborn. "Come on, man," he'd said, leaning against my doorframe in that casual way of his. "When's the last time you did something social? And I mean actually social, not hiding in the library corner table and eavesdropping on other people's conversations." "I don't eavesdrop," I'd protested, though we both knew it wasn't entirely true. "You observe," he'd said, making air quotes. "Fine, come observe at a party for once. Live a little." So I'd gone against my better judgment and spent most of the evening nursing a single beer and watching Marcus work the room like he was born to it, laughing with groups of people I vaguely recognized from campus, charming girls who hung on his every word, playing drinking games with the enthusiasm that seemed genuine rather than performed. He was good at this, being the center of attention. It was natural for him in a way I envied and didn't understand. I preferred the edges of things, the quiet corners where you could observe without being observed. But Marcus thrived in the spotlight, drew energy from it like some kind of social solar panel. I was considering making my escape when someone cranked the music up another notch and the party shifted into its second phase, the loud, sloppy, inhibition-free phase where bad decisions were made and later regretted. I found myself pressed against a wall in the living room watching Marcus play beer pong with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the stakes. He was winning, of course. Marcus had good hand-eye coordination and the kind of confidence that made difficult shots look easy. But he was also drinking more than usual, and I could see it in the slight looseness of his movements, the way his laugh got a little too loud. By midnight, he was definitely drunk. Not sloppy drunk. Marcus held his alcohol better than that, but drunk enough that his usual careful control was slipping. I watched him stumble slightly as he high-fived his beer pong partner, watched him lean a little too heavily against the kitchen counter while talking to some girl with elaborate braids. I should have suggested we leave then, should have been the responsible roommate and steered him toward the door before things got messier. But something kept me rooted in place, content to watch from my corner and catalog the small ways alcohol changed him. Made him more tactile, more openly affectionate. Made him throw his arm around people's shoulders and hold on longer than necessary. When he finally found me again around 12:30, his eyes were bright with drink and his cheeks were flushed. "There you are," he said. like I'd been hiding instead of standing in the same spot for the past hour. I was looking for you. I'm right here, I said. Right here, he repeated, stepping closer. Close enough that I could smell the beer on his breath, mixed with his usual cologne, something clean and woody that I'd grown embarrassingly familiar with. Always right here? There was something in his voice, some undercurrent I couldn't name. Before I could ask what he meant, someone called his name from across the room, and his attention shifted. But not before he squeezed my shoulder in a way that felt deliberate, meaningful. The party wound down gradually, people filtering out in groups or pairs, leaving behind the detritus of a successful Saturday night. I helped clean up because that's what you do, stacking red cups and collecting empty bottles while Marcus held court with the remaining hangers-on. When we finally left around 2 a.m., Marcus was quiet in a way that felt different from his usual post-party come-down. Not sleepy quiet or thoughtful quiet, but something more uncertain. He walked close enough to me that our shoulders bumped occasionally, and every time it happened, he didn't move away. Back at our apartment, I expected him to disappear into his room the way he usually did after nights out. Instead, he followed me to the living room and collapsed onto our second-hand couch with a heavy sigh. Good party, I said, because the silence felt like it needed filling. Was it? He looked at me with those dark eyes, and there was something vulnerable in his expression that made my chest tighten. I kept losing track of time, kept thinking about other things. I didn't ask what other things, didn't trust myself to handle whatever answer he might give. Instead, I sat down on the opposite end of the couch, maintaining what felt like a safe distance. But Marcus, in his alcohol-loosened state, apparently had different ideas about personal space. He shifted closer, then closer again until he was pressed against my side. "You don't mind, do you?" he asked, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. Mind what? I wanted to ask. But the words stuck in my throat because Marcus was warm against my side, solid and present in a way that made my heart race. "No," I said instead. "I don't mind." He relaxed then, settling more fully against me, and I felt the exact moment when his breathing evened out and he fell asleep. His head found my shoulder like it belonged there, and his hand somehow ended up resting on my thigh, fingers curled loosely against the denim of my jeans. I should have woken him up, should have suggested he'd be more comfortable in his own bed. But I didn't move. Couldn't move. For the first time in months, Marcus was still, unguarded, and I was hyper-aware of every point of contact between us. The weight of his head on my shoulder, the warmth of his breath against my neck, the way his fingers twitched slightly in sleep, like he was dreaming of playing guitar. I sat there for what felt like hours, watching the shadows change as cars passed by outside, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. He smelled like beer and cologne and something else, something distinctly him that I'd noticed in our shared spaces, but never this intensely. Around 4 a.m., I felt him stir. His breathing changed first, became more conscious, and I knew he was awake even before he lifted his head. "Shit," he mumbled, voice rough with sleep. "Sorry, It's fine," I said quickly. He sat up slowly, running a hand through his hair, and I immediately missed the warmth of him against my side. In the dim light filtering through our window, his face was soft with sleep and something else, some emotion I couldn't read. "I should go to bed," he said, but he didn't move to get up. "Yeah," I agreed, but I didn't move either. We sat there for a long moment, the space between us feeling charged despite the physical distance. Marcus looked like he wanted to say something, his mouth opening slightly before closing again. "David," he started, then stopped. "What?" He shook his head. "Nothing, just thanks for letting me crash on you like that." "Any time," I said, and meant it more than I should have. He smiled then, small and uncertain, before finally pushing himself up from the couch. But as he walked toward his room, he paused at the doorway and looked back. "You're a good friend," he said. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and watched him disappear into his room. But I stayed on the couch for another hour, staring at the spot where he'd been sitting and trying to understand why the word friend had felt like both a comfort and a disappointment. After that night, something shifted between us. Nothing dramatic. We still maintained our separate routines, still moved around each other in our small space with practiced efficiency. But there were moments now, small cracks in the careful distance we'd maintained. Like the way Marcus started lingering in the kitchen when I was making coffee in the mornings, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his skin when he reached around me for a mug. Or how he'd started asking my opinion about things that didn't require my input, like which shirt to wear or whether he should trim his hair. "What do you think?" he'd ask, emerging from his room in different outfits like I was his personal stylist. "About what?" "This shirt. Does it look okay?" It always looked more than okay. Marcus had the kind of lean, athletic build that made most clothes look like they'd been tailored for him specifically. But I'd learned to give him the attention he seemed to want, looking him over with what I hoped appeared to be casual assessment. "Looks good," I'd say, and he'd smile like my approval meant something. The hoodie incident happened in mid-October during that stretch of autumn when the weather couldn't decide if it wanted to be warm or cool. I'd left my favorite sweatshirt, a faded Northwestern hoodie I'd stolen from my older brother years ago, draped over the back of a chair after doing laundry. When I went to look for it the next morning, it was gone. I found Marcus in the kitchen making what appeared to be his fourth cup of coffee of the day, wearing my hoodie like it belonged to him. The sleeves were pushed up to his elbows, and the fabric hung slightly loose on his frame, but not in an unflattering way. If anything, the casual fit made him look younger, more approachable. "Nice hoodie," I said, leaning against the doorframe. He looked down at himself like he'd forgotten what he was wearing. "Oh, shit. Sorry, I grabbed it without thinking. Laundry day emergency." "It's fine," I said, though something about seeing him in my clothes made my stomach do that familiar flip. "Looks good on you." Marcus glanced at me, something flickering in his expression. "Yeah?" "Yeah." I expected him to offer to give it back then, or at least make some comment about returning it later. Instead, he just nodded and turned back to his coffee, like the conversation was settled. He wore it for 3 more days. I'd see him in it when he was lounging around the apartment, when he was studying at the kitchen table, when he was talking on the phone with friends. Each time I felt that same strange twist in my chest, possessive and pleased in a way I didn't want to examine too closely. On the 4th day, I found it carefully folded on my bed, smelling like his cologne mixed with fabric softener. There was no note, no explanation, just my hoodie, returned as quietly as it had been taken. But that evening, when I wore it to study in the living room, Marcus kept glancing at me with an expression I couldn't read, like he was remembering something or trying to figure out a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. "Good to have it back?" he asked eventually. "Yeah," I said. Then, because something compelled me to add it, "though it looked good on you too." Marcus went very still for a moment, his textbook forgotten in his lap. When he looked at me, there was something intense in his gaze, something that made my heart skip. "Did it?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. The question felt loaded with implications I wasn't ready to unpack. Instead of answering directly, I just shrugged and looked back at my book, but I could feel him watching me for several more minutes before he finally returned to his reading. The conversation started getting more pointed after that, small moments of honesty that felt like tests, like we were both trying to figure out how much truth the other could handle. It was a Wednesday evening in late October when Marcus asked the question that changed everything. We were both in the living room, ostensibly studying but really just existing in the same space in that comfortable way we'd developed. I was reading for my American economic history class, and Marcus was supposedly working on some project for his graphic design program, though he seemed more interested in sketching random patterns in the margins of his notebook. "You ever feel like you're pretending to be something?" he asked suddenly, not looking up from his sketch. I marked my place in my textbook and considered the question. With Marcus, I'd learned seemingly casual questions often had deeper currents underneath. "Every day," I said. He looked up then, meeting my eyes directly. "Really? Don't you?" "Yeah," he said, setting down his pencil. I guess I do. It's just, sometimes I wonder what would happen if I stopped, if I just was honest about who I really am. There was something vulnerable in his voice, something that made me want to close the distance between us and offer comfort I wasn't sure I was qualified to give. What do you think would happen? I asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his fingers playing with the corner of his notebook. I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. That's a pretty wide range of possibilities. He laughed, but it was soft, uncertain. Yeah, well, that's kind of the problem, isn't it? The not knowing. I understood what he meant. The space between who we were and who we presented to the world was sometimes so vast it felt unbridgeable. I'd spent most of my life perfecting the art of being unremarkable, of blending into backgrounds and avoiding attention. But lately, with Marcus, I'd started to wonder what it would feel like to be seen, really seen. Maybe the not knowing is part of the point, I said. Maybe if we knew for sure what would happen, it wouldn't be worth doing. Marcus looked at me with that intense focus of his, like he was trying to memorize my face or solve some complex equation that involved both of us. You're probably right, he said. Doesn't make it any less terrifying. No, I agreed. It doesn't. We went back to our respective work after that, but the conversation lingered in the air between us like smoke. I found myself stealing glances at Marcus, wondering what truths he was keeping to himself, what parts of his carefully constructed persona were performance and which were genuine. The answer, I was beginning to suspect, had something to do with the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. November arrived with an early cold snap that made our apartment feel even smaller and more intimate. Our heating was inconsistent at best, which meant we spent most evenings layered in sweatshirts and drinking hot coffee or tea to stay warm. It was during one of these cold evenings that I first noticed Marcus had started finding excuses to be in whatever room I was in. If I was studying in the living room, he'd migrate there with his laptop. If I was cooking dinner, he'd suddenly remember dishes that needed washing. If I was reading in bed, I'd hear him moving around in his room, restless in a way that felt somehow connected to my presence. I tried not to read too much into it. Marcus had always been social, had always preferred company to solitude. But this felt different, more intentional, more focused. Like his attention had narrowed to include primarily me. The realization should have been uncomfortable. Instead, I found myself anticipating these moments of proximity, looking forward to the subtle ways our routines had begun to interweave. It was a Thursday evening in mid-November when everything came to a head. The day had been gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that made you want to stay inside and drink warm things and avoid any unnecessary interaction with the outside world. I'd spent most of it in the library, working on a research paper that was slowly consuming my will to live, and I'd come home exhausted and slightly damp from the walk between buildings. Marcus was already there when I arrived, which wasn't unusual. His class schedule was lighter than mine, and he often had afternoons free. What was unusual was the way he looked when I walked in, restless, uncertain, like he'd been waiting for something. Hey, he said, looking up from his position on the couch. How was the library? Academically productive, spiritually crushing, I said, hanging my jacket on the hook by the door. The usual. He smiled at that, but it was distracted, not quite reaching his eyes. Want some coffee? I made a fresh pot. It was nearly 6 p.m., too late for coffee unless I wanted to be awake until 2 a.m., but something in his tone made me nod anyway. Sure, thanks. I followed him into the kitchen, watching as he poured coffee into 2 mugs with careful attention. His movements seemed deliberate, like he was using the simple task to buy time or gather courage for something. Marcus, I started, but he interrupted me. I've been thinking, he said, not looking at me as he handed over the mug. About what we talked about, the pretending thing. My heart did that familiar skip, and I wrapped my fingers around the warm ceramic to give my hands something to do. Yeah, I think I'm tired of it, he said. The pretending. We were standing close in our small kitchen, close enough that I could see the exact shade of brown in his eyes, could count the individual eyelashes if I wanted to. The air between us felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. "What would not pretending look like?" I asked, my voice coming out softer than I'd intended. Marcus set his mug down on the counter and took a half step closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "I don't know," he said, "but I think it might start with admitting that I don't spend nearly as much time thinking about girls as everyone assumes I do." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. My heart was racing now, and I had to force myself to breathe normally. "What do you think about instead?" I asked. Marcus looked at me then, really looked at me, and there was something raw and vulnerable in his expression that made my chest tight. "You know what I think about," he said quietly. I did know, had known on some level for weeks now, but hearing him say it, even indirectly, made everything suddenly real in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. Before I could respond, before I could figure out what the appropriate response even was, Marcus's phone rang from the living room, loud and jarring in the charged quiet of our kitchen. The moment shattered. Marcus stepped back, running a hand through his hair, and I could see him pulling his walls back up in real time. "I should get that," he said. "Yeah," I said, "of course." He disappeared into the living room, and I stood alone in the kitchen, gripping my coffee mug and trying to process what had just happened, what had almost happened. That night, we moved around each other carefully, like we were both afraid that too much direct contact might ignite something we weren't ready to handle. But I could feel the weight of unfinished conversation between us, the sense that we'd opened a door that couldn't easily be closed again. I lay awake for hours that night, staring at the ceiling and replaying every word, every look, every moment of almost contact. Somewhere on the other side of our thin wall, I could hear Marcus moving around in his room, restless in a way that matched my own sleeplessness. The next few days passed in a strange limbo. We were polite to each other, careful, like we were both afraid of saying too much or not enough. Marcus seemed to be giving me space to process what he'd shared, and I was grateful for it even as I missed the easy intimacy we'd been building toward. But I could feel him watching me sometimes, when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Could feel the weight of questions he wasn't asking, of conversations we weren't having. It couldn't last forever, this careful distance. Something would have to give. It did on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in late November. I'd finished my last class of the day earlier than usual and decided to head home for a shower before diving into the mountain of reading I had planned for the evening. The apartment was supposed to be empty. Marcus had mentioned something about meeting with his study group at the library, so I wasn't particularly concerned about privacy or noise. Our bathroom was small, barely large enough for a toilet, sink, and the world's most inadequate shower stall, but the water pressure was decent and the hot water lasted longer than you'd expect from such an old building. I'd grown to appreciate these small moments of solitude when I could let my guard down completely and just exist without performance or observation. I was standing under the spray, eyes closed, letting the hot water work out the tension in my shoulders from hours hunched over textbooks, when I heard it. A floorboard creaking in the hallway. I went very still, listening. Our apartment was old enough that every surface had its own particular sounds, and I'd learned to distinguish between the settling of the building and actual footsteps. This was definitely the latter. Marcus was home. I tried to remember if I'd locked the bathroom door, though our lock was so flimsy it was more psychological comfort than actual security. The shower curtain was opaque enough for privacy, but there was a gap at the bottom, and the frosted glass door of the shower stall had a crack that ran from top to bottom, a flaw that made the whole enclosure feel precarious. Another creak, closer this time. My heart started beating faster, though I couldn't say exactly why. It wasn't like Marcus had never been in the apartment while I was showering before. We developed a system of communication, calling out when we were home, knocking on doors before entering shared spaces, basic roommate courtesy, but he hadn't called out, hadn't announced his presence. I finished rinsing quickly, suddenly hyper-aware of every sound. The water hitting the shower floor seemed impossibly loud. My own breathing felt amplified in the small, steamy space. When I turned off the water, the silence that followed was thick, expectant. I reached for my towel, wrapping it around my waist, and that's when I saw it. Movement through the crack in the door, just a shadow at first, but then more substantial. A figure in the hallway just outside the bathroom. My breath caught in my throat. Through the crack, I could see into our small hallway, and there was a mirror mounted on the wall opposite the bathroom door, a cheap, warped thing we'd bought at a thrift store because it was better than nothing. In that mirror, reflected and distorted but unmistakable, I could see Marcus. He was standing just outside the bathroom door, perfectly still, and he was looking in my direction. Our eyes met in the reflection. For a moment that felt suspended outside of time, neither of us moved. I stood frozen in the shower stall, towel clutched to my chest, water still dripping from my hair. Marcus stood equally still in the hallway, caught in the act of, what? Watching, waiting. His eyes were wide, startled, like he hadn't expected to be seen, but he didn't look away, didn't move, just stared at me through the layers of reflection and refraction, through glass and steam and the impossible intimacy of the moment. My heart was racing so fast I was sure he could hear it from the hallway. The air in the bathroom felt thick, charged with something I couldn't name but recognized in my bones. How long had he been standing there? How long had he been watching? And more importantly, why wasn't he leaving now that he'd been caught? I should have said something, should have called out, made some noise to break the spell of the moment. Instead, I found myself frozen, caught between embarrassment and something else, something that felt dangerously close to anticipation. Marcus took a half step forward and I could see his reflection more clearly in the mirror. His face was flushed, his breathing slightly elevated. He looked like someone who'd been caught doing something he shouldn't, but also like someone who wasn't entirely sorry about it. The moment stretched between us, taut with tension and possibility. Then, before I could find my voice, before I could figure out what the appropriate response was to this impossible situation, Marcus spoke. His voice was soft, barely audible through the door, but I heard every word with crystal clarity. "Wait," he said. Can we talk?" I stood there, frozen, water still dripping from my hair onto my shoulders, running in cool rivulets down my back. The towel felt inadequate, like it was made of tissue paper instead of terry cloth. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. What was I supposed to say? What could I possibly say that would make sense of this moment? Marcus was still there in the hallway. I could see his shadow through the crack, could sense the tension radiating from him even through the door. He wasn't moving closer, wasn't retreating, just waiting, like he was giving me the space to decide how this would go. I started, then stopped. My voice came out rough, uncertain. "Yeah, okay, just give me a minute." I heard him exhale, a sound that might have been relief or might have been something else entirely. "I'll be in the living room," he said, his voice carefully neutral. His footsteps retreated down the hallway and I was alone again in the steamy bathroom, heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. I caught sight of myself in the mirror above the sink, flushed, wide-eyed, looking like someone who'd just been caught in a lie he'd been telling himself for months. Because that's what this was, wasn't it? All those moments I'd cataloged, all those glances and touches and loaded conversations, I'd been pretending they were one-sided, pretending that whatever I was feeling was mine alone to carry. But Marcus had been standing in that hallway, had been watching me through the crack in the door, and when he'd been caught, he hadn't run away or made excuses. He'd asked to talk. I dressed quickly, hands shaking slightly as I pulled on jeans and a t-shirt. My hair was still damp, but I didn't want to keep him waiting any longer than necessary. Whatever was about to happen, whatever conversation we were about to have, I needed to meet it head on. When I emerged from the bathroom, I found Marcus sitting on our couch, elbows on his knees, staring at his hands. He looked up when he heard my footsteps, and there was something so vulnerable in his expression that it made my chest tight. "Hi," he said quietly. "Hi." I sat down on the opposite end of the couch, maintaining distance that felt both necessary and artificial. We'd shared this space so many times over the past months, had fallen into easy intimacy here, but now everything felt charged, precarious. So, I said, because someone had to start. So, Marcus ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd seen him make hundreds of times when he was nervous or thinking hard about something. I owe you an explanation. Do you? I was standing outside your door, he said simply. I was watching you. That's not okay. I considered this. It should have felt like a violation, should have made me angry or uncomfortable. Instead, what I felt was something closer to relief, like a truth had finally been spoken aloud. How long? I asked. What? How long were you standing there? Marcus looked away, color rising in his cheeks. I don't know, a few minutes maybe. I came home and heard the shower running and I was going to call out, let you know I was back. But then I saw, he gestured vaguely toward the bathroom. The door was cracked and there was steam coming out and I could see movement through the glass and he trailed off, shaking his head like he was disgusted with himself. You just what? I stopped walking, he said. I should have kept going, should have gone to my room or called out or done literally anything else. But I stopped and I looked and I couldn't make myself move. The honesty in his voice was almost painful to hear. I could see how much this confession was costing him, how much he was bracing for my rejection or anger. Marcus, I said carefully, why couldn't you move? He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something break open in his expression. Because I've been thinking about you, he said, for months. Thinking about you in ways that friends aren't supposed to think about each other, and seeing you like that, knowing you were right there, knowing I could just... He stopped, shook his head again. I'm fucked up. I know I'm fucked up. You're not fucked up. I was watching you shower, David, without your permission. That's pretty fucked up. I was quiet for a long moment, processing his words and the weight of emotion behind them. Outside, the rain continued its steady percussion against our window, and somewhere in the building someone was playing music too loud. Can I ask you something? I said finally. Yeah, anything. When you were standing there, when you were watching, what were you thinking? Marcus went very still. What do you mean? I mean, were you thinking about how wrong it was? Were you thinking about leaving? Or were you thinking about something else? He stared at me for several seconds, and I could see him weighing his words, deciding how much truth he was willing to share. I was thinking about how beautiful you are, he said quietly. I was thinking about how long I've wanted to see you like that, without barriers, without pretending. I was thinking about how much I wanted to touch you. The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were unwelcome, but because they were exactly what I'd been afraid to hope for. And then? I asked. And then you looked up and saw me in the mirror and I realized what I was doing and I felt sick with myself. But I also, he paused, searching for words. I also didn't want to leave. Even knowing it was wrong, even knowing you hadn't given me permission to see you like that, I didn't want to look away. I absorbed this, turning it over in my mind. You looked terrified, I said. When our eyes met, you looked terrified. I was terrified. Of getting caught? No, Marcus said. Of what it meant. Of what I wanted it to mean. Something shifted in my chest then, a loosening of tension I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten it was there. We were finally talking about it, this thing that had been building between us, this undercurrent that had been shaping our interactions for months. What did you want it to mean? I asked. Marcus looked at me with an expression so raw it was almost difficult to witness. I wanted it to mean that you felt it too, this thing between us. I wanted it to mean that all those moments, the dinner conversations, the way you look at me sometimes, the night I fell asleep on your shoulder, I wanted them to mean what I hoped they meant. And what did you hope they meant? That you might want me the way I want you. The words hung in the air between us, honest and devastating. I could see how much courage it had taken for him to say them, could see him bracing for my response. Marcus, I said softly. It's okay, he said quickly. If you don't, if this is all in my head, if I've been reading everything wrong, it's okay. We can pretend this conversation never happened. We can go back to being roommates and nothing else. But even as he said it, I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe it would be that simple, that something fundamental had shifted between us, and there was no going back to the careful distance we'd maintained before. What if it's not in your head? I asked. Marcus went very still. What? What if you haven't been reading everything wrong? What if those moments meant exactly what you hoped they meant? I watched his face change as my words sank in, watched hope and disbelief war in his expression. David, he said, my name barely a whisper. I felt it too, I said. All of it. Every look, every touch, every time you lingered too long in doorways or found reasons to be in whatever room I was in. I felt it, and I've been terrified of what it meant. Terrified? Because you're... I gestured at him, trying to find words for something I'd never had to articulate before. You're Marcus. You're confident and magnetic, and you collect people like I collect books. You date girls, you throw parties, you're everything I'm not. And I'm just what? I'm just me. I'm the guy who reads on Friday nights and measures coffee beans and hides in library corners. I'm not the kind of person someone like you notices. Marcus stared at me like I'd said something incomprehensible. Are you kidding me right now? What? David, I've been losing my mind over you for months. Months. Do you know how many parties I've skipped because I wanted to stay home and watch you read? Do you know how many conversations I've cut short because someone mentioned you and I couldn't think about anything else? I blinked, taken aback by the intensity in his voice. You think you're unremarkable, he continued, but you're the most interesting person I've ever met. You notice everything, you think about everything, you have opinions about things most people never even consider. You're kind without being soft, you're smart without being pretentious, and you have this way of listening that makes people want to tell you their secrets. Marcus, I borrowed your hoodie because it smelled like you, he said. I've been finding excuses to be near you because I'm addicted to the way you exist in space. I fell asleep on your shoulder and pretended to stay asleep longer than I was because I didn't want to move away from you. Each confession hit me like a small revelation, recontextualizing moments I'd filed away as wishful thinking. The night we had dinner, I said slowly, when you asked what people really think of you, I was trying to figure out what you thought of me, whether there was any chance you might see me as something other than your loud, obnoxious roommate. You're not obnoxious. I'm loud, though. You are loud, I agreed, and something in my tone made him smile despite the tension of the moment. And you're quiet. We're probably a terrible match on paper. Probably. We looked at each other across the small distance separating us on the couch, and I could feel something settling between us, some acknowledgement of what we'd both finally admitted. So what now? Marcus asked. It was a fair question. We'd crossed some invisible line with this conversation, had moved from the realm of possibility into something more concrete. But I had no roadmap for what came next, no experience with wanting someone the way I wanted him. I don't know, I said honestly. I've never done this before. Done what? Any of it. Wanted someone like this. Talked about wanting someone like this. I don't know what the rules are. Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering this. What if there aren't any rules? What if we just figure it out as we go? That sounds terrifying. Yeah, he agreed. It does. But there was something in his voice, some note of possibility that made the terror feel manageable. Like maybe being scared together was better than being safe apart. Can I ask you something else? I said. Yeah. When did you know? When did you realize that what you were feeling was this? Marcus leaned back against the couch cushions, thinking. Remember that night you couldn't sleep and you came out to the kitchen around 2 a.m., about a month ago? I nodded. I'd been fighting insomnia, had gotten up to make tea, and found Marcus sitting at our small table with his laptop working on some design project. You made enough tea for both of us without asking if I wanted any, he said. Just assumed I'd want to share whatever you were having. And we sat there for like 2 hours, not really talking, just existing in the same space. You were reading something on your phone, and I was working, and it was so comfortable, natural. I remember. At some point, you fell asleep in your chair, just dozed off with your tea still in your hands. And I sat there watching you sleep, and I realized that I wanted to do that forever. I wanted to share 2 a.m. cups of tea with you, wanted to watch you fall asleep in uncomfortable chairs, wanted to know what you were reading and what you were thinking about. I wanted all of it, all the mundane, ordinary moments. And that scared you? Terrified me. Because I'd never wanted someone like that before. I'd dated girls, I'd had relationships, but it was always surface level, fun, but not deep. With you, it felt like I could drown in how much I wanted not just your body, but your thoughts, your attention, your time. I understood what he meant. The want I felt for Marcus wasn't just physical, though that was certainly part of it. It was larger than that, more encompassing. I wanted to know what he thought about when he woke up in the morning, wanted to watch him work on his design projects, wanted to be the person he turned to when he was happy or sad or confused. I've been thinking about that night too, I said. I remember waking up and you were still there, still working. You'd put a blanket over me. You looked cold. You could have woken me up, told me to go to bed. I didn't want you to leave. The simple honesty of it made my chest tight. I didn't want to leave either. When I woke up and saw you there, saw that you'd stayed up with me even though you didn't have to, it felt like what? Like home, I said. Like the kind of home I'd never had before but always wanted. Marcus's expression softened, and I saw something shift in his posture, like he was allowing himself to believe that this conversation was really happening, that we were really sitting here admitting these things to each other. David, he said, and there was something different in his voice now, less uncertainty, more warmth. Yeah? Can I? He started to reach toward me, then stopped, his hand hovering in the space between us. Can I touch you? The question was so simple, so careful, but it sent electricity shooting through my nervous system. He was asking permission for something we'd both been wanting for months, something that should have been natural but felt momentous. Yes, I said. Marcus closed the distance between us slowly, giving me time to change my mind or pull away. But I didn't want to pull away. I wanted to see what it would feel like to have his hands on me intentionally, without the pretense of accident or casual contact. His fingers found mine first, tentative and warm. Such a small point of contact, but it sent waves of awareness up my arm. His hands were slightly rough from his guitar playing, and I could feel the calluses on his fingertips as he traced along my knuckles. Is this okay? He asked. Yeah, more than okay. He turned my hand over, palm up, and traced the lines there with one finger. Such a simple touch, but it was more intimate than anything I'd experienced before. There was intention behind it, acknowledgement of want and permission to explore that want. I've thought about this, he said quietly, still focused on my hand. Touching you like this, having permission to. What else have you thought about? The question came out more breathless than I'd intended, but Marcus didn't seem to mind. If anything, the sound of my voice seemed to embolden him. His fingers moved from my hand to my wrist, circling it gently, then up my forearm. Everything, he said. I've thought about everything. His touch was making it difficult to concentrate on conversation, but I pushed through the distraction because I wanted to know, wanted to understand the scope of what had been building between us. Tell me, I said. Marcus looked up at me then, his hand still resting on my arm, and there was something almost shy in his expression despite the boldness of his touch. I've thought about kissing you, he said. About what you'd taste like, what sounds you'd make. I've thought about falling asleep next to you and waking up next to you. I've thought about cooking dinner together and fighting over what to watch on TV and all the boring domestic stuff that I never cared about before. Each confession made my heart race faster, made the want in my chest expand until it felt like it might consume me entirely. I've thought about those things too, I admitted. Yeah. The kissing especially. Marcus's hand went still on my arm, and when I looked up at him, his eyes were dark with something that might have been hunger. David, he said, and it sounded like a question. I knew what he was asking, could see it in the way he was looking at my mouth, in the way his breathing had changed. He wanted to kiss me, wanted to close the final distance between admission and action. And I wanted it too, had been wanting it for so long that the possibility of it actually happening felt surreal. Yes, I said, answering the question he hadn't quite asked. Marcus moved closer then, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my face. His free hand came up to cup my cheek, thumb brushing along my cheekbone in a gesture so tender it made my eyes flutter closed. "Look at me," he said softly. I opened my eyes and found him watching me with an intensity that made my breath catch. There was want there, yes, but also something deeper, something that looked like the same overwhelming feeling that had been growing in my chest for months. "I need you to know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't just physical for me. This isn't just about wanting to kiss you or touch you, though I do want those things. This is about wanting all of you, all the time. This is about being completely gone for you in a way that should probably scare me more than it does." "It doesn't scare you?" "Oh, it terrifies me," he said with a small laugh, "but not enough to stop." And then he kissed me. It was soft at first, tentative, like he was still giving me the chance to change my mind. But when I kissed him back, when I let my hand come up to rest against his chest and felt his heart racing beneath my palm, something shifted between us. The kiss deepened, became more urgent, months of tension and want finally finding expression. Marcus tasted like coffee and something uniquely him, and the sound he made when I parted my lips beneath his sent heat shooting straight through my core. His hands found my hair, fingers tangling in the still damp strands, and I could feel him trying to pull me closer even though there was barely any space left between us. I wanted to crawl into his lap, wanted to eliminate every inch of distance, but some part of my brain was still functioning enough to remember that we were on our couch, in our living room, having our first kiss after months of careful distance. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, I could see my own wonder reflected in Marcus's eyes. "Wow," he said. "Yeah. Wow." We stayed close, foreheads nearly touching, sharing the same air. I could feel the rapid rise and fall of his chest, could see the flush across his cheekbones. "That was," he started, then shook his head. "I don't have words for what that was. Good different or bad different? The best different, like life-changing different." I knew what he meant. That kiss had rewritten something fundamental in my understanding of what it meant to want someone, to be wanted in return. It had been soft and desperate and perfect, and I already wanted to do it again. "Marcus," I said. "Yeah? I need you to know something, too." He waited, giving me his full attention in that focused way of his that had always made me feel seen. "I've never felt this way before either," I said. "Not about anyone. And it's not just that I've never wanted someone the way I want you, though that's true. It's that I've never trusted someone enough to want them this way, to want to be vulnerable with them." Something shifted in Marcus's expression, became softer, more tender. "You trust me?" he asked. "I trust you," I confirmed. "Even when it scares me, even when I don't understand what's happening between us, I trust you." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment like he was absorbing my words, letting them settle into something he could believe. "I won't hurt you," he said. "I can't promise I won't mess this up somehow because I've never done this before either, but I won't hurt you intentionally. I won't take this for granted." "I know." "Do you? Because I need you to know that this matters to me. You matter to me. Not just as my roommate or my friend, but as this. Whatever this is between us." "I know," I said again, and I did. I could see it in the way he was looking at me, could feel it in the careful way he was touching me, like I was something precious, something worth protecting. We might have stayed like that indefinitely, wrapped up in the newness of finally being honest with each other, if not for the sudden sharp knock at our front door. We sprang apart like we'd been electrocuted, the spell of the moment broken by the harsh intrusion of the outside world. My heart, which had been racing pleasantly from Marcus's proximity, was now racing for an entirely different reason. "Shit," Marcus muttered, running a hand through his hair. "I wasn't expecting anyone." Another knock, more insistent this time. "Marcus, you in there?" A voice called from the hallway. Male, vaguely familiar. "That's Jake," Marcus said, referring to one of his friends from his design program. He said something earlier about maybe stopping by, but I thought. He looked at me with an expression that was half apology, half frustration. "I'm sorry, I can tell him to come back later." But even as he said it, I could hear voices in the hallway now. Plural, not just Jake. It sounded like Marcus's entire study group had decided to show up at our door. "Marcus, come on, man, we know you're home," another voice called. We saw the light. "It's okay," I said, though it felt like anything but okay. We'd been balanced on the edge of something important, something that couldn't be rushed or recreated on demand. "You should let them in." "I don't want to let them in," Marcus said. "I want to keep talking to you. I want to—" He gestured vaguely at the space between us, at the conversation we'd been having, at the kiss we'd shared. "I know, I want that too. But they're not going away." More knocking, more voices. It was clear that Marcus's friends had settled in for a siege. "Later?" Marcus asked, and there was something almost desperate in his voice. "We can finish this later?" "Yeah," I said, "later." But even as I said it, I wondered if later would feel the same as this moment had. If we'd be able to recapture the vulnerability and honesty that had brought us to that kiss, or if the interruption would give us both time to second-guess everything we'd admitted to each other. Marcus stood up reluctantly and walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the handle to look back at me. "This isn't over," he said, and it sounded like both a promise and a plea. "No," I agreed. "It's not over." He opened the door, and suddenly our quiet, intimate space was flooded with people and noise, and the particular chaos that seemed to follow Marcus wherever he went. Jake and 3 other guys from his program poured into our small living room carrying laptops and coffee and the aggressive energy of college students with a project due. "There you are," Jake said, clapping Marcus on the shoulder. "We've been trying to reach you for like an hour. Did you forget we were supposed to work on the Morrison presentation tonight?" I watched Marcus's face change as he processed this, saw him shift from the soft, vulnerable person who'd just been kissing me back into his more public persona, still warm, still charismatic, but more guarded. "Right," he said. "The presentation. I lost track of time." His eyes found mine across the room, and I could see the apology there, the frustration at having this moment stolen from us. "Hey, David," Jake said, noticing me for the first time. "Hope we're not interrupting anything." "Not at all," I lied smoothly. "I was just heading to my room anyway, got some reading to catch up on." It was the polite thing to say, the roommate thing to say, but I saw something flicker in Marcus's expression, disappointment maybe, or concern that I was retreating back into the careful distance we'd maintained before. "You don't have to leave," he said quickly. "We can work in my room, or—" "It's fine," I said. "Really, you guys need the space." I gathered my things and made my escape before the conversation could become more awkward, but not before catching Marcus's eye one more time. He looked like he wanted to say something, wanted to somehow communicate everything that had happened between us in a single glance. "Later," I mouthed silently. He nodded, but I could see the uncertainty creeping into his expression, the fear that later might mean never, that the interruption had given us both time to come to our senses and retreat back to safer ground. In my room, I lay on my bed and listened to the sounds of their study session through the thin wall, voices discussing design concepts, the clicking of keyboards, the occasional burst of laughter. Normal sounds, familiar sounds, but they felt different now. Like I was hearing them from the outside, like I was no longer quite part of Marcus's world in the same way I had been before. The contradiction was strange. We just admitted our feelings for each other, had shared our first kiss, had crossed every line we'd been carefully avoiding for months. By rights, I should have felt closer to him than ever before. Instead, I felt oddly displaced, like I wasn't sure where I fit in his life now that everything had changed. Hours passed. I tried to read, tried to focus on the economic theory I was supposed to be studying, but my mind kept drifting back to the feeling of Marcus's lips against mine, to the weight of his hand in my hair, to the way he'd looked at me like I was something worth wanting. Eventually, the voices in the living room quieted and I heard the sounds of people leaving, goodbyes called out, footsteps in the hallway, the front door closing, then silence. I waited, listening for Marcus to come to my door to knock and ask if we could continue the conversation that had been so rudely interrupted. But minutes passed, then more minutes, and there was no knock. Maybe he was giving me space, I told myself. Maybe he was processing everything that had happened, trying to figure out what it meant. Maybe he was as overwhelmed as I was by the speed at which everything had changed between us. Or maybe he was having second thoughts. The possibility sat in my stomach like a stone. It would be understandable, after all. In the heat of the moment, with adrenaline and months of suppressed attraction driving the conversation, it had been easy to make admissions and promises. But now, with time to think, maybe Marcus was realizing that acting on these feelings would complicate everything. Our living situation, our friendship, our carefully constructed separate lives. Maybe he was remembering that he'd never been with a guy before, that whatever this was between us would mean redefining his understanding of his own sexuality in ways that might be more challenging than he'd initially realized. Maybe he was simply scared. I was certainly scared. Terrified, actually. Not of wanting Marcus, that ship had sailed months ago, but of what wanting him might cost, of how much I had to lose if this went wrong. Around midnight, I heard movement in the hallway, footsteps that paused outside my door, then continued to the bathroom, the sound of the shower starting up, running for 10 or 15 minutes, then shutting off. More footsteps, closer to my door this time. A soft knock. My heart jumped into my throat. "Yeah? David?" Marcus's voice was quiet, uncertain. Are you awake?" I was off my bed and at the door before I'd consciously decided to move, my hand on the handle. "Yeah, I'm awake. Can we? Would it be okay if we talked? I know it's late, but I can't sleep, and I keep thinking about earlier, and I opened the door before he could finish the sentence. Marcus was standing in the hallway in pajama pants and a t-shirt, hair still damp from his shower, looking younger and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. There were shadows under his eyes, and his usual confident posture was nowhere to be found. "Hi," he said softly. "Hi. I'm sorry about earlier, about Jake showing up when he did. I completely forgot they were coming over and the timing was—" "It's okay," I said. "These things happen." "Is it okay, though? Because when you left for your room, you seemed like you were pulling away. And I've been sitting out there for the past hour trying to figure out if you were just being polite about the interruption, or if you were having second thoughts about everything." The vulnerability in his voice made my chest ache. I stepped back from the doorway, a wordless invitation for him to come in, and he accepted it gratefully. My room was small, made smaller by the presence of another person, but Marcus had been in here before. Usually when he wanted to borrow something or had a question about our shared living situation. This felt different, though, more intimate. Like he was entering a space that belonged to both of us now instead of just me. I wasn't having second thoughts, I said as he settled onto the edge of my bed. "Were you?" "No, God, no. If anything, I've been thinking about it more. About you, about what happened between us. I can't stop thinking about it." Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by a renewed awareness of his proximity. He was sitting on my bed in my room, and the memory of kissing him was suddenly fresh and immediate. "I've been thinking about it too," I admitted. "Yeah?" "Yeah, about the kiss, about everything we said to each other, about what it means." Marcus nodded, then was quiet for a moment, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. "Of course. I've never felt this way before, about anyone. And I don't just mean the wanting, though that's part of it. I mean the completeness of it. Like everything in my life has been leading up to knowing you, to feeling this way about you." The words hit me like a physical force, and I had to sit down on the bed next to him because my legs suddenly felt unsteady. "Marcus, I know it's a lot," he said quickly. "I know we've only been talking about this for a few hours, and maybe it's too much too fast, but I need you to know that this isn't casual for me. This isn't experimentation or curiosity or whatever. I think I'm falling in love with you. I think I've been falling in love with you for months. The confession hung in the air between us, raw and honest and so much more than I'd expected. My heart was racing again, but not from nervousness this time. From joy, from relief, from the overwhelming realization that what I'd been feeling wasn't one-sided after all. I think I'm falling in love with you too, I said quietly. Marcus closed his eyes like he was absorbing the words, letting them settle into something he could believe. Really? Really. And you're right, it's not just the wanting, though that's definitely part of it. It's the way you make me feel like I'm worth paying attention to. It's the way you listen when I talk, really listen, like what I'm saying matters. It's the way you've made our apartment feel like home instead of just a place I sleep. When Marcus opened his eyes, they were bright with emotion that made my breath catch. Come here, he said softly. I moved closer, close enough that our thighs were touching, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. I want to kiss you again, he said. Is that okay? More than okay. This time when he kissed me, there was less uncertainty and more intention. His hands found my face, cradling it gently as he deepened the kiss, and I could taste the minty freshness of his toothpaste mixed with something that was purely him. I lost myself in the sensation of it, the warmth of his mouth, the soft sound he made when I kissed him back with equal fervor, the way his fingers threaded through my hair like he was trying to anchor himself to me. When we broke apart this time, we stayed close, breathing hard, foreheads touching. That was even better than the first time, Marcus murmured. We're getting better at it. Good. I want to get better at all of it. At this, at us, Yayo,